Hi there, everyone. Back here with your next lecture, which you can tell by the title here. We're going to start looking at some of the relatively recent history, but not super recent history, uh, which I'm going to be delivering in installments, and I've titled it "Global Politics in the Modern Era." Uh, I think it's important to get the background of how a lot of diplomacy has worked in the last couple of centuries, in particular in the 1800s and much of the 1900s. For every generation, it's slightly different about kind of where the cutoff is between modernity and current affairs and the distant past and the antiquity. But anyways, I don't want to go all the way back in time to classical period, but I also don't want to just begin global politics in 1945 and be like, oh, World War II was over, and this is the Cold War, or worse, just not give you any of that at all, and just jump right into, well, these are the issues today. There's little context there, so I understand that we don't have that many classes. We have to, as instructors, choose priorities, and this is one of the ones I think is worth spending 2 weeks on, to understanding the kind of diplomatic history that we've all inherited, because a lot of the things that happened maybe a century or more ago, we're dealing with some of that. We're going to be talking in the next lecture about some of the decisions that were made at the end of World War I by the victorious powers, and perhaps in the benefit of hindsight, they might have chosen differently, but they did not know then what we know now. So I want to make sure that we know now what happened back then. It's somewhat arbitrary, but I'll pick up the story in the last decade of the 18th century, and of course there's a history before that. If you really want good histories of kind of international relations that are easy to understand, but also rich in detail, I have to recommend. It's a classic work. You may know of it already, but Paul Kennedy's work on the rise and fall of great powers. He has an argument he makes as a historian as well, but he's great for giving the time period before and after this. And I can also recommend one of Henry Kissinger's many books, which is titled simply Diplomacy, which is, though as most Kissinger books are, they are long, it's actually quite easy and interesting to read. And so they can go way back before this period, and then they can bring it up to more recent times. But I can't go back to the 1600s or the 1100s or any of that stuff. So we're starting in 1790, because I think things are changing. I mean, things are always changing, but I think things that are about to change in significant ways that are going to have echoes down the road, decades and even centuries later. And I'll start the story with the French Revolution, which gets underway, well, you can debate it, but I'll say in 1789, and certainly by 1791, the French Revolution is beginning, for its own reasons, which we don't need to get into in a class on global politics. The revolution itself is fascinating. If any of you have had a chance to study the revolution, you know that it's actually the story of kind of several eras that happened one after the other. We're not going to get into the weeds of any of that, but the revolution itself is interesting. And it's important for us because what goes on inside of France ends up having repercussions for the international relations of Europe. And a note about why I'm centered on Europe in 1790, it's not because of any sort of Western-centric predisposition. I think it's good to know Western history, but I'm a fan of knowing other histories as well. It's that I think a fairly honest appraisal of the accumulation of military economic power shows that Europe was the predominant force in the world, though not the only, in 1790. In their own respects, China, Japan, much of India was not under real British control. Of course, the Ottoman Empire is part of the story I'm going to tell, so I have not excluded those either. But much of it is based in Europe. And it's all Europe. It's Eastern, Central, and Western. Perhaps earlier in the period with more power concentrated further west. But if you can see down the lecture here, that is also going to change over time. One of the themes of the French Revolution is its kind of anti-monarchical or anti-monarchy views. And the French, as you may know, will go on to execute their monarch. And, you know, if we think about how things work today, well, you know, that's an internal affair. Who cares? Well, this is a big deal in Europe, where monarchy is not rare, but it's the standard. It's the norm of governing countries in the 1790s. And again, as you probably know, the monarchies of Europe were frequently related one to the other. They even reference this in some popular dramas these days that talk about the British royal family or other royal families and their ties abroad and how their cousins were intermarried. Okay, the point still holds true in the 1790s. The killing of a monarch, of a head of state, was a grave concern for other monarchies. And the general anti-monarchical sentiment that was growing in France was also likewise a growing concern in its European neighbors. Very briefly, France had been arguably the dominant land power in Europe for the preceding at least 150 years. On other areas, overseas and at sea, it was not the unquestioned leader. There were other rivals who could probably claim those things. But on land in continental Europe, France was viewed as kind of the most powerful of all. Not more powerful than all the rest combined, but the single largest power on the continent. And so when its public took this sharp anti-monarchical turn and executed its monarch, that was enough of a pretext for other European countries to declare war on revolutionary France. The French, for their part, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty military stuff, which I'm not even qualified to teach you about, they're facing a kind of enemy at the gates crisis where you have invading armies that are coming into France. A lot of the parts of the old French military machine were gone because they were linked to the monarchy, the church, the both, or were thought to have been linked to one or the other. And so the French military, as it were, looked to be in pretty dire straits, and it became one of the additional tasks of leaders of the revolution to form a kind of new army that would be able to repulse these attacks by France's neighbors. Those begin in the early to mid 1790s. Again, I'm not going through all the stages of the revolution, as interesting as it is. Suffice it to say that by the end of the 1790s, one Napoleon Bonaparte, crowns himself Emperor of France. And beginning in 1798, there are going to be a series of wars that are collectively known as the Napoleonic Wars. And they're going to go until 1815, which is the next point on our outline. The Napoleonic Wars are again, interesting. And it's not one war, right? It's several various alliances of European monarchies, usually arrayed against France and whatever allies she could garner. And Napoleon and France usually do quite well, especially earlier on. As the French armies move across Europe, they bring with them some of the ideas of the French Revolution. Some of those are the ideas of the French Enlightenment, but ideas such as liberalism, also the idea of what we might call self-determination or self-government. The idea that distinct groups who see themselves as different peoples ought to have their own states. There was a strong nationalistic component to the French army, who felt that France, since the Revolution, had kind of been under siege by the rest of monarchical Europe. And, the whole idea of the siege mentality is kind of the rest are out to get you, and you rally to the flag, rally to the nation. And that kind of fierce nationalism also spread with French armies and conquests through Europe, and played into, or I should say played alongside of, some of those ideas about limited government, liberalism, and self-determination for different people. Suffice it to say that eventually, and for the last time, Napoleon and France are defeated in 1815. And the rest of Europe that has been on and off allied against France for almost 20 years at this point, they got to decide what to do with the peace now that France has been defeated. And they make the decision that they're not going to create a terribly harsh peace on the French, and they're going to bring the French back into the system. It's going to require the restoration of monarchy in France. But once that's done, that gives France a common identity, common cause in the rest of the European balance of power system. So you can see from the outline that it's the Congress of Vienna that is the kind of negotiations over the end of the the Napoleonic Wars. And one of the long-term outgrowths of that is something that becomes known as the Concert of Europe system. And it relates to the second point under that Congress of Vienna in the world after 1815. The Concert of Europe is not like the League of Nations or today the United Nations or anything like that, in that it's not a permanent institution, but it was a system of meetings that were held when crises affected peace in Europe. The great powers would meet, and they would try to address the conflicts peacefully. They would try to negotiate an end. Now, in negotiation, there's always the threat of coercion behind it. That if a country doesn't get what it wants through diplomacy, it may use force. But in the concert system, there's I mean, that's always there, but states generally don't want to use force because force used in one place is unable to be used elsewhere. And there's only so much force to go around. And so the appearance of force, we talk about a balance of power, but it's the same idea, was frequently a determinant of who got what, when, and how in the international system through the Concert of Europe system. I'll back up to the point before that in the outline just so that it's not skipped. But with the Congress of Vienna and the ending of the Napoleonic Wars, all the major powers in Europe at that time were some form of monarchy. In some cases, they were more limited, as in the English example. In other cases, those monarchies were far more authoritarian, as in Austria, as in the Ottoman Empire, as in the Russian Empire. Even with those differences, there was common agreement, though, that democracy, self-determination, liberalism, the idea of a limited government, none of those things were welcome, particularly in continental Europe. In short, they agreed no more French revolutions. There were a number of reasons for that. One was that, well, look at what happened the last time one of the great powers went through one of these kind of democratic and liberal revolutions. We got almost 20, 25 years of war on and off, and it came close at times to toppling many more countries' political systems than just the French. That kind of instability is not something that those in power want. If you're in power, you prefer stability because stability means you and your heirs, in the case of monarchy, remain in power. And that's usually above all what you're trying to do. Peacefully resolving disputes, this is moving on to the second point, which I've briefly touched on, meant that there was not the same threat of general war in Europe, which may have necessitated some of the drastic measures that European countries took in response to the revolutionary France's model of fighting, which was to have a large citizen army. Monarchies liked their own relatively small professional army that was loyal to the monarchy. They did not want to go and give lots of other people military training and arms and hope that they would fight for a monarchy which they may not strongly identify with. And so if they could avoid keeping that kind of military experience out of the hands of many, if a kind of future revolutionary situation developed, the armed forces of the other monarchies would collectively act to repress those uprisings. And that is exactly what will happen in the so-called 1848 rebellions, even though some of them took place in 1847 and went on in 1849. We call it the 1848 rebellions. In those in which you had simultaneous rebellions or attempted revolutions in Europe and outside of Europe, in continental Europe, it ended up being the Russian army that was the cudgel that ended up crushing a lot of the liberal, the more democratic attempted revolutions that were ultimately unsuccessful. But between that agreement to peacefully resolve disputes and the 1848 rebellions, there is still the process of the ongoing colonization of other parts of the world. And I should also qualify the previous point. The idea was to keep Europe from being in a general war where most all of the great powers, or all the great powers, are at war with one another. They're in alliances. They're fighting against other alliances. That was what Europe wanted to avoid, because they believed that that might be a catalyst for the destruction of monarchy. I'll pause here and say, and apparently they were right. Because if you fast forward 104 years, one of the many outcomes of the Great War, which was the general war that the concert sought to avoid, is that it pretty much destroyed monarchy in the remaining great powers that had it. By 1919, though still in name, England was a constitutional monarchy, the United Kingdom, I should say. In practice, the monarch had become almost apolitical. Almost. And Parliament was the real sovereign-making body in the United Kingdom. And France, through a different series of events, ends up establishing a series of republics and is some form of democracy by the time World War I ends. But that was not true. Italy, as a unified state, wasn't around at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but Italy is going to go a different route. But in Russia, in Germany, and in Austria Hungary, as well as in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire wasn't strictly necessarily monarchy, but it was certainly autocratic. But monarchy was destroyed by World War I. And it didn't matter whether you were on the winning side or the losing side, though candidly the winning side didn't have monarchy. But the sides that lost happened to be monarchies, and that form of government was destroyed. And so the sense of their predecessors back 100 years earlier, they understood the risks well. And they were exactly right about what might be the catalyst for the destruction of political order. All right. The agreement is to avoid general war in Europe. However, conflict outside of Europe, particularly in territories yet to be fully colonized or imperialized, there armed conflict was more likely to happen, though to be avoided if possible, because there was always the possibility that a war began over colonies far outside of Europe may spread back into Europe and lead to a more general war. As I mentioned in passing about 5 minutes ago, the 1848 rebellions are the kind of rebellions that the Concert of Europe had been set up to prevent. And in the end, those rebellions, those attempted revolutions, end up by and large failing. Although, even in the countries in which it failed, including Prussia, the failure of the rebellion still worried the leadership in those countries about, well, what happens next time? Might be able to repress it for a time, but eventually these kinds of things will happen if we don't do something else. How are we going to stay ahead of these ideas? The ideas of nationalism and of self-determination were particularly dangerous for empires that governed over lots of different ethnic and national groups. Groups of people who perceived themselves as a different people fundamentally than those who governed over them. Because in nationalism, as with self-determination, each of those peoples should have had a right to decide for themselves which government they wanted to be a part of. But those were just ideas. Those weren't realities. And the monarchies, in many cases also empires, and multi-ethnic or multinational empires at that, were not interested in hearing the preferences or the desires for self-determination from their peoples. Many of these had been taken through conquest, joining the right side in some war at some point, and monarchs were they were very much intent on holding on to them. And so what's going on in this whole period, it's kind of in the background, I haven't made it a separate point, but in this whole post-1815 period, is that monarchs are looking for ways to present themselves to their people as the rightful rulers, whose rule ought not be questioned, but could not do so by basing their claims to legitimacy on democratic authority. Monarchs couldn't say, well, we're here and making laws because you all wanted it. That they could not do. And so monarchs continued to use what those before them had used as justifications for why they rule. And, the particular monarch or the particular state in question, you'd get a slightly different reason, but it frequently was some form of, well, I ought to be able to rule because I have brought glory and power to our people. I've expanded the borders, either here or overseas. Other countries are jealous of what we've achieved, and that my performance is what I'll rest my authority on. Some would simply claim that, look, this is tradition, bloodlines, it's my rightful place. That argument was becoming harder and harder to defend as others rose to challenge it and said that's just not good enough. Other than having been the fortune of been born or married correctly, that's not enough to justify your rule. So expanding the realm, military conquest, colonialism, imperialism, those were plausible alternative sources of legitimacy for monarchs who were concerned about their standing among their people, particularly if they governed over people of other ethnic and national groups. Another justification that was sometimes invoked was that, well, they had the right to continue to rule because, either God willed it or they were doing God's work on earth by defending fellow co-religionists. So the French, among other powers, will argue that they have a special right, an obligation to defend Christians, and in several of those cases, Catholic Christians at that. For the Russians, they'll frequently claim to be the defenders of Orthodox Christians. The Russian Empire also claims that it needs to continue ruling the way it does, as the Tsar is also the defender of Slavic peoples, not just Russians, but other Slavic peoples in Europe. And the power the Tsar accumulates and sometimes has to wield either at home or abroad is done so not in the name of the Tsar, but in the name of promoting Orthodox Christianity or protecting Slavic peoples from abuse by non-Slavic peoples. It's notable here, what can we learn from the past? Well, I think the problem, I don't know if you've been unfortunate enough to take other classes with me or have heard me say this, even if you haven't, but I think one of the problems with looking to history for lessons is that history gives us too many lessons and we never know what ones are necessarily relevant to our own particular time. But I would just point out that in these cases, the ones I'm talking about, these justifications that monarchs would pursue implicitly to justify their rule, they were frequently justifying themselves in what they were doing as defensive, even though by probably more objective standards, they were frequently engaged in land grabs and aggression in pure power politics. But the justifications were rarely ever pointed that way, or painted that way, or portrayed that way. It's something I'd encourage you all to do, which is to be skeptical of the justifications, no matter how noble they sound. Right? Protecting our religious brethren from persecution, who could be opposed? Protecting our fellow ethnic kinsmen against abuse by others. Well, geez, who could be opposed to that? And that I need to remain in this position so I can continue that protection. And challenging me at home hinders my ability to do that. Well, now you can probably start to hear, are you doing these things and saying these things because they matter? Or are you doing and saying these things to avoid criticism and a challenge to your power? Foreign policy issues were frequently invoked to build domestic support. Not as frequently did it go the other way, but it is an example of what we sometimes called intermestic in political science, the interplay between international politics and domestic politics happened all the time. Even though we tend to talk about foreign and domestic policy as different things, they've rarely been used that way. And that frequently domestic issues do affect foreign policy, and in some cases, vice versa. All right. Like most all systems, the concert of Europe was not perfect. And it did fail at times. It's worth assessing in its 100 years between 1850 and 1914 whether the system of informal gatherings of great powers was perhaps was it a better way to keep global peace than the alternatives? But it doesn't always work, and it breaks down beginning in 1853. And it does so actually going back to one of the ways that monarchies legitimated themselves. Okay, there's a long history here I'm not going to tell you. But the Ottoman Empire was a very interesting entity, to say the least. It had lots of different groups of Muslims, various sects of Islam. It had multiple different sects of Christianity, Catholic and Orthodox primarily. Lots of different linguistic and ethnic and cultural groups. It is nothing if not interesting. Okay, having said that, the Ottoman Empire was also, it made deals, as great powers do, with European countries. Now, they had at one point made a deal with the Russians, who were kind of their perpetual nemesis. The Russians had gradually been pushing the Ottomans back, let's see, at this point for centuries, we can say. Not always, but usually the Russians were beating the Ottomans, and it seemed maybe it was getting a little bit worse over time. But the Ottomans had made a concession to the Russians to allow them to be recognized as having a special position, protectors and intermediaries on behalf of Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. And so that foreign policy concession allowed the Tsar to say, hey, look, here's another example of me looking out for our religious brethren. The poor Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire are under my protection. And representatives of the Tsar in those Orthodox communities would frequently act as go-betweens when there was a kind of grievance between the local community and some other groups or Ottoman authorities. It was something, and it was something that monarchs needed. But then the Ottomans, for a different set of reasons, decide to go ahead and recognize France as the protectors of all Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And that brought the French claim into conflict with what had been promised to the Russians. And so the Russians demanded that that be rescinded and the Russian position with Orthodox restored. And the Ottomans said no. This deal with France was the one that they were going to honor. And this led to a war breaking out, at first between the Ottoman Empire and Russia in 1853. The French and the British are going to join the Ottoman side against the Russians, though they do so for different reasons. It's not because the British and French love each other. Far from it. They're going to continue to be great power rivals into the next century, and colonial rivals at that. But they ended up on the same side in this war because the French wanted to protect the concession to France as the defender of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. French monarch would not want to lose something like that. The British went to war because of what was going on in what we would call the Middle East and further off in Asia. The British have more firmly established themselves in India by the 1850s, although there's a big mutiny that's coming later on in the 1850s. They're going to have to deal with it, and they do survive. But the British are concerned that the Russians are moving near British colonial borders in, we'll say, Asia, and those colonies in Asia that England had. And, kind of global politics in the 19th century 101, Russia is a land power, England is a naval power. And so the British do not want to be fighting the Russian army in Asia, right, the largest of continents. And the British are going to be worried, and this is going to play out more later on in World War I, that the Russians are going to defeat the Ottoman Empire and the whole empire may collapse, and that the Russians would rush in and grab as much Ottoman territory as they could. And that would be an unwelcome development, potentially threaten Britain's communication with its other Asian colonies, and it would have disrupted the power greatly. And Britain wasn't eager to see that. They figured it was smarter to throw their weight behind the weaker side, the Ottoman side, and attempt to balance the Russians and hope that basically at the end of this war there would be very little change, and if they could weaken the Russian army and concentrate its forces in Europe or in Russia, that would take pressure off of British possessions and interests elsewhere. Later in the war, Prussia and Austria are going to join in on the Ottoman, French, British side. And the war ends in a Russian defeat, in a fairly humiliating one. I mean, the British and French use their navies, and they're able to do a lot of fighting on Russian territory. It's called the Crimean War because it refers to the Crimean Peninsula. I'm going to switch you over to the map after. So this is the world at 1815. Crimea, my mouse cursors are, right, France is here, England is here. Crimean War, a lot of it is fought over here. There's going to be a siege of Sevastopol. These, of course, are names that came up recently in the last decade, as Crimea was formerly Ukrainian. Before that, it was Russian, and the Russians in the last decade have moved forces back into Crimea and subsequently annexed Crimea. They've added it back to Russia. And I'm teaching the Crimean War to remind you that what is this now? Almost 70 years ago, a little bit less, I think. Crimea was very much part of Russia, although much of the world today does not recognize as legitimate the Russian annexation of Crimea. In any event, the Russians lose, and they lose while fighting on their home turf. It really shows that technologically, the Russians territorially they're huge, but man, do they have a ways to go when it comes to industrialization. Because of Russia, and you can't see all of it on here, because it's massive east-west expanse, it had quite a bit of railroads that would go east-west, but it did not have as many that ran north-south. And so in many cases, it was as difficult, if not harder, for the Russians to move troops and supplies in Russia as it was for the British and French to move them from across Europe, frequently overseas, and fight the Russians, and usually do quite well in Russia's backyard. So the Russians are defeated, and it's going to take them a while to rebuild. But this is going to be important to note for what comes next. The Russians, who were traditionally one of the great powers, and they were the saviors of the Eastern and really it's the Central European monarchies. In the 1848 rebellions, feel they've kind of now been turned on, ganged up on, and defeated. And so they're bitter and weak, which is frequently a kind of toxic brew when it comes to global politics. All right, next point. New states, new powers, German and Italian unifications. Maybe I'll start with this map. So again, this is 1815. The colors on here do not contrast that well, but there is a territory here that is Prussia. It's kind of this orangish yellowish color that my mouse cursor is highlighting over. You see there are also lighter yellow principalities and territories. There's even this line of them that runs down through Austria, what becomes known as Austria Hungary. You see Austria Hungary is here in the kind of pink color, right in the center of Europe. Also an interesting entity, but it ends up being a country that it's called the dual monarchy, because it's exactly what it is. It has two monarchs, although the Austrian one was usually viewed as the preeminent, a kind of more powerful of the two. But anyways, that's an interesting way to have a territory with two monarchs, but they're there. Prussia's up here. Right, Russia's France. Okay. Down here in 1815, you can see that Italy is not Italy. Italy is a couple of different countries that they have here: the Tuscan states, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Sardinia and Corsica. I'm not sure what their status was in here, truthfully. Anyhow, inspired by the idea of nationalism, the idea, in this case, it's that the Italian people ought to have an Italian state. Italy is unified, and unifying those disparate kingdoms created a new, albeit minor, but it is a new power in the European concert system. In my view, more important to understanding how global politics works from the 1860s and really 1871 on is the formation of Germany. Now, you can see here that there's a Germanic confederation. Excuse me. Previously, a lot of these entities had been a part of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. And the kind of famous quip about the Holy Roman Empire, which comes to an end, incidentally, during the Napoleonic Wars in early 1800s, is that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It didn't rule over non-imperials. But anyways, that was the name that stuck with it. There's a lot of Germans in the Holy Roman Empire. But France, for close to 200 years, had as a major foreign policy priority keeping the German people in separate polities, kingdoms, whatever you want to call them. But do not let the German people unite into a single state. That had been a cornerstone of French foreign policy, and the French had done well by it. The French were not eager to see the German people unified so close to them because of the challenge it could have spelled for French power. Enter some interesting folks. Kaiser Wilhelm the First comes to power. And Kaiser is a derivation of Caesar from the Roman Empire. Caesar, Kaiser. Prussia is the preeminent German state, but it certainly is usually viewed as one of the kind of lesser of the great powers, but still a set of interests that needed to be satisfied. Kaiser Wilhelm I is concerned about how the revolutions of 1848 went, but also sees an opportunity to use nationalism as a way to enhance Prussian power, because the Germans are in other people's countries. And so Germany becomes one of those states that actually nationalism is not really a threat to it. Liberalism, democracy, those are bigger threats to the Kaiser. But he believes that he can actually use nationalism and the drive for a greater Germany to actually justify not needing democracy and not needing alternative forms of government. So, and by the way, Kaiser Wilhelm and his frequent chancellor, a guy named Otto von Bismarck, they also, once it becomes available, make frequent use of the anti-communist card as a justification for why certain reforms can't go forward. Anyways, Wilhelm I and Bismarck, there's a debate about how much of this was planned and how much of this was Bismarck just improvising. A few years back, a new biography of Bismarck came out. It was a big deal. The author, while noting that Bismarck usually won, had virtually no sympathy for the man himself, and found him to have a number of deplorable character defects. Putting those aside, he did pull off some interesting maneuvers. And the idea is to aggrandize Prussian territory, to add to it other German people, and to use nationalism as a tool against the left, which is the enemy of monarchy, the military tradition, and the things that Wilhelm the First and Bismarck stood for. If nothing else, Bismarck understood the limits of power, brute power, and he is sometimes portrayed as a kind of warmonger. I don't think that's right. I think he understood that both military conquest and diplomacy have their role in statecraft, and in his case also in state making, creating something that did not exist, and that part of the statesman's job is to know when it's time to fight and when it's time to negotiate. So, there are going to be a series of wars known as the, wait for it, Wars of German Unification. It's actually a better map here. The problem with this map, I don't know if you can see it. This spells out some of the territorial gains. The early territorial gains from Prussia are actually up here in Schleswig and Holstein. And those are going to be added early in the 1860s. They're going to be added to Prussia, and it's going to take down Denmark, a relative minor power on Prussia's border. Remember that Russia is the kind of historical power on Prussia's eastern border, but they have been laid low by the Crimean War. And so there are opportunities that are possible for Germany or Prussia now that in more normal times the Russian Empire might be strong enough and inclined enough to intervene in, but it's not going to take as active a role in the German Wars of Unification. The first major conflict, though, is the war, and I'll just briefly go back to this map, is the war with Austria Hungary. And again, the big deal was this, and I'm oversimplifying. It wasn't really about taking territory away from Austria Hungary. It was that Prussia wanted the German Confederation to join Prussia in a larger German state, and that Austria Hungary would not allow that without a fight, because they were also committed to keeping the Germans spread out in a variety of polities, countries, we might say. And so in 1866, Prussia and Austria-Hungary end up at war. Again, Russia had been defeated by the Crimean War. This was, the view in Russia's, who do you pick on here? They had they did not like Austria-Hungary because Russia and Austria-Hungary were competing. You can't see it in this map. I think you can see it. No, you can't see it in this map either. Throughout the 1800s, the European part of the Ottoman Empire, again, it's in Europe, is gradually pushed south and east toward Constantinople and what's sometimes known as Asia Minor, what we would call present-day Turkey. And so there are a lot of losses. Greece is finally given up in the 1830s. And Russia and Austria-Hungary, for their own reasons, want to get as much of this territory as they can. And so there's a lot of natural conflict between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Prussia and Russia, there are familial links. And Prussia is certainly viewed as the lesser threat militarily than Austria-Hungary, although Prussia is formidable. But the Russians really aren't eager to take sides in all of this. Bismarck had been busy, though. He turns to the newly created Italian state and promises them, if they join the war against Austria-Hungary, he promises in the peace that Italy will gain some territory in I guess we could call it, in northern Italy. You can see the Tyrol right here, which actually contains a lot of non-Italians, which is kind of a strange objective for a nationalist project, but it would have added territory to Italy. So Bismarck has a two-front war planned with Austria Hungary. Russia's willing to sit out. Denmark was just beaten by Prussia and can't open up a northern theater against Prussia. So the big question is, well, why doesn't France get involved for the old reasons? Why doesn't France, Catholic France, join Catholic Austria Hungary and go after Prussia, knowing that the game was about the German Confederation joining Prussia? The answer is, with a lot of oversimplification, the French, as did most other experts, got it wrong. They assumed Austria-Hungary, the stronger power, was likely going to prevail, which is what France wanted anyways. And so why spend French blood or treasure if Austria-Hungary is going to do it for you? They were happy to fight the Prussians to the last Austro-Hungarian soldier. If Prussia started doing well, France could always enter the war later, or so they believed. What they did not count on was what actually happened, which is a rapid Prussian victory. And with that, the Austro-Hungarians are now taken down. And now this makes more sense. You can see these elements that I tried to show you in the previous map are part of that German Confederation are going to be ready to be incorporated into Germany. They're not going to be immediately added in 1866, but the door is open to formally annexing them to Prussia when Bismarck and Wilhelm the First believe it's the right time. There is one more obstacle. Let's see if it's here. Well, this is after the fact. Okay. There's one more obstacle to the unification of German people and adding them to Prussia, and that's France. And France has sat out long enough that it has no immediate allies because the Austro-Hungarians have been defeated. The Russians they were defeated and they are bitter relative to the French because of the Crimean War. The Ottoman Empire is too far away to help, and Great Britain is more concerned about limiting French power than they are Prussian. And again, when it comes to continental land wars, you got to leave it to the continental powers. And Italy is largely too far away to be of much assistance. There's going to be a window of opportunity for Prussia to go to war with France, mano a mano, one-on-one. And they're going to try to take from France two territories named Alsace and Lorraine. Sometimes they're talked about almost as one Alsace-Lorraine. But it was territory that was part of France that had a majority German people and would be useful as part of the Prussian Empire, which is about to become the German Empire. France isn't going to give them up willingly. And Bismarck is able to kind of bait France, the leader of France, into a war. And the French, if nothing else, are confident that they're going to win. However, the early fighting, the Prussians move quite quickly. Prussia had at this time the densest rail networks in the world. It's not a large country territorially, but the amount of railroads for the territory that was there was the densest, which facilitated the rapid movement of troops and allowed the Prussians to seize the initiative, defeat the French army, push the fighting into France, capture the French head of state, and besiege Paris. It was 1870 into 1871. So, needless to say, after all that, the French surrender. And now, there is no power on Prussia's border that is strong enough, particularly now that the French have just been knocked out, that is strong enough to prevent the following, which is the creation of this. This is the German Empire. You can see 1871 is the yellow parts that were formerly part of that German Confederation. Now that France has been defeated, you can see Alsace here, you can see Lorraine here. This is taken in the war, and these are going to be added to the German Empire. And so this is the map you get of Europe in 1871. Again, the colors here are a bit pastel, so it's maybe hard to differentiate it, but the Germany's borders are now what my mouse cursor is trying to trace. That's formidably larger, particularly this part down here, than the old Prussian state. Much of the rest of the map is the same. You can see the Ottoman Empire. I don't know why they call it Turkey, but it's the Ottoman Empire. It's reduced compared to what it was back in 1815. Right? The Ottoman Empire is up here, and you can see it's starting to fall back. Greece has already been carved off on the southern end. It's starting to fall back and become more of an Asian empire, less of a European one. You can't see all the way around on the 1850 map, but you see that the Russians have now pushed down around the Black Sea, and they're going to try to push the Turks back further if they can. Anyways, that's what's going on there. So this is, in my view, a very important development for global politics going forward. Is the creation of Germany as a single and powerful state in the center of Europe. Why? Well, as you're about to learn in the coming lecture, it's hard to envision a First World War or a Second World War without a political entity like Germany. It's hard to see, given Germany's role in the onset of World War I, and especially World War II, which you don't really get World War II, I think, without World War I. And those, of course, were cataclysmic events for European power and global politics, but they did, from the perspective of American, usher in a new order. Different. But the creation of Germany is a big deal. And again, this is the aforementioned unified Italy. So I guess this answers my previous uncertainty. I guess Corsica was not. That is French. That's right. I believe Napoleon was actually Corsican. And Sardinia was part of Italy. So now I know. I didn't 15 minutes ago. Anyways, that is this bit. Now, 1871, war's over, German Empire declared. War has played its role for Bismarck and for Wilhelm. There are challenges at home, which are interesting, but not what I'm going to talk about. And Bismarck's not looking for another war, in short, because there's not too much more that it would give Germany that wouldn't make Germany look like an aggressor. Up to this point, Germany can claim nationalism, self-determination as justifications for what it's doing. If it starts incorporating territory without a whole lot of Germans, that's going to make it look like a much bigger threat than it is. And so Bismarck here, and for the rest of his time in office, which will go into the wow, he's going to be around until the end of the century. He's going to be forced out by Kaiser Wilhelm II. He's going to try to play the role of peacemaker. And so there are conflicts that are coming between Russia and the Ottoman Empire again. And he's going to volunteer to mediate that. There's conflict over principles of colonialism. And he's going to have Berlin host an international conference on that. It's said that Bismarck at this time is really trying hard to avoid war because he doesn't want, especially to the British, to be perceived as a warmonger, or that Germany was an inherently antagonistic state. The French were defeated and isolated. The British he was trying to keep neutral. And this is interesting, he turns to Germany's former foe, Austria Hungary, as well as Russia, and offers them deals where there'll effectively be an alliance, a kind of defensive alliance. This is known as the Three Emperors League: the Russian Emperor, Austro-Hungarian Emperor, even though there were two monarchs, and Kaiser Wilhelm, the German Emperor. And in short, what it does is it guarantees Germany's southern and eastern flank in any future war. The states commit themselves to not fighting one another and to negotiate when there are conflicts. So this will keep Russia and Austria-Hungary for a time from going to war with each other over stuff that's going on down here in the Balkans. And so it maintains peace. It keeps Germany out from having to have to choose between one or the other if they go to war, because all three of them are going to be together. And basically Germany is interested in keeping a balance of power, and so they'll support whoever's the stronger side. But that's going to allow Bismarck to continue to play that role of peacemaker and mediator, and showing other great powers Germany is not a threat. Under Bismarck, the goal was to keep France without allies, and it works. The British aren't going to ally with France for colonial reasons, among others. They're not going to ally with Russia because they have differences, again, born of British colonialism. And Austria-Hungary, there's not a whole lot in common here, which actually kind of makes it easy to ally with them, but the British aren't going to be in a terribly strong position to help Austria-Hungary in a number of its conflicts. So, anyways, that's the general plan. Good relations with the Ottomans as well, where he could get them. But that was not a huge concern. And it's worth mentioning that it works. And sometimes you have a great plan and nothing comes of it. This is a great plan, and it kind of worked as drawn up. Kaiser Wilhelm the First then dies. He's succeeded not by his son, but by his grandson, who becomes Kaiser Wilhelm II. Bismarck had an interesting, kind of strange relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm I. Even though Bismarck was quite old, like to show himself as a manly man, he kind of viewed Kaiser Wilhelm I as a kind of father figure. And frequently broke down crying over the stresses of his job and confiding in the Kaiser of Germany. Anyways, Kaiser Wilhelm II is not his grandfather. And I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't know what the issue is. But Kaiser Wilhelm II is just a weird guy. He is just strange as European leaders come. He's an odd one. I suspect from a lot that I've read, and I can highly recommend to you a number of books, but Margaret Macmillan's book. It's really the second of a 2-volume history of World War I, but it's called The War That Ended Peace, and it's about how the world got into World War I. She cites serially the flaws and faults of Kaiser Wilhelm II. She also wrote Paris 1919, which is all about the peace agreement that ended the war. And so both of those are excellent reads if you want to know this history in detail. Kaiser Wilhelm II had a deformed arm, and yet he was constantly trying to present himself as a kind of macho man. In some ways, that was similar to Bismarck, who didn't have the same deformities. His was he was not quiet, but his was a different kind of machismo. But in short, I think their two egos couldn't stand each other, and Kaiser Wilhelm II had the power. Bismarck served as effectively the advisor and at the pleasure of the Kaiser, and could be dismissed at the pleasure of the Kaiser. So Kaiser Wilhelm II turns to Bismarck and tells him to resign. And at this point, domestically, Bismarck has lost all of his domestic supporters. He may not have had that, he really didn't have that many to begin with, but the few he had were pretty good, but he had alienated all of them in his years of service. And every time he got what he wanted, he would lose another ally or two. And so in the end, there was no one to stand up for him. So he has to resign. In some ways, at the peak of his influence. If it sounds like I have complimented Bismarck, I will do no more of that. Except to say that he, as skilled jugglers do, he could keep a lot of things in the air long enough to get what he wanted. Wilhelm II, believing he was good at a lot of things, that in fact he wasn't good at, tried to take up the task of German diplomacy, thinking he could do it better than Bismarck, and he bungled it. So the Three Emperors League I talked about a few minutes ago, the alliance between Russia, Germany, and Austria Hungary, to not fight each other and, talk out their conflicts. For whatever reason, Kaiser Wilhelm II believes that what Germany really needs is an alliance with the United Kingdom, where if war comes, the United Kingdom will fight for Germany. And again, this just shows how incredibly ignorant Wilhelm II was. The United Kingdom never did that in this time. England's preferred method was to not have to take sides in a continental war or alliance system. Wait to see what happened if war came, and then support the less powerful side to ensure the balance was maintained. They did not, for any continental power of significance, offer an alliance of mutual aid in war. Moreover, as I mentioned now several minutes ago, it was a strange thing for Germany to ask. United Kingdom is a great naval power, a troops stationed around the world. That means that there were fewer on hand to be put in land combat in Europe. And so even if he got what he wanted, which was extremely unlikely, it's not at all clear that having got it, Germany would be that much safer, especially when it compares to what Germany lost, which is what I'm about to tell you. So the Three Emperors League was not a permanent treaty. It had to be renewed every several years. And so it was up for renewal in 1890. And Kaiser Wilhelm II says, I ain't going to do it. We're not renewing it. He understood global politics well enough that he understood the British and the Russians didn't like each other. And what he thought he was doing, thought he was clever, was he was showing the British that he was no good friend of the Russians and that would bring the British closer to him. Well, it did kind of do that. And other things happen in the 1890s that in some ways do bring the British closer, but they're never really close enough that they're considering a military defense treaty with Germany. It will depend a little bit on who's in power, who holds what ministry in England, but it's generally true the British weren't strongly considering this. So, tells the Russians, forget about you. Austria Hungary, you're okay as far as Kaiser Wilhelm II is concerned. We'll maintain ties with you. Almost as soon as Wilhelm II tells the Russians to get lost, then the French immediately reach out, and the Russians are happy to take it. And the French offer the beginnings of a military pact. It's the Franco-Russian Agreement of 1891. And it doesn't name any particular aggressor, but it does point out that if either side is attacked by another great power, they won't join that great power in attacking the other. And if they are attacked by two or more great powers, that the other will be obligated to fight on the other's behalf. So, what this means is that if Austria Hungary goes to war with Russia, say over something in the Balkans, France wouldn't join Austria Hungary. But if Germany and Austria Hungary went to war with Russia, then France would declare war on Germany. And vice versa. Although France was concerned not about Austria Hungary and Germany, they were concerned about Italy and Germany attacking France. Anyways, the main power that they were concerned about was Germany. I mean, France could handle Italy on its own. Russia could handle Austria-Hungary on its own. The decisive power in those conflicts would be Germany. And what Bismarck understood, while he liked to dress in his cavalry uniforms, he never did all that much soldiering himself, but he understood the military situation. The reason why he allied with Russia and with Hungary, as I said earlier, was to secure Germany against war on these fronts. The war with France would take place along this front, and France had no allies under Bismarck. Now, France has an ally, and a very considerable one in Russia. Right? This only took a year to get started from the time that Wilhelm II thinks he knows better. And immediately it goes the wrong way. And Bismarck saw this threat coming, and he was able to act before it. Wilhelm II is not that smart. What else? So, Germany in the 1890s is going to do something else that's a bit strange. Well, they're going to do two strange things under Kaiser Wilhelm II. The first is that Wilhelm II is going to send a congratulatory message to the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, who were fighting the British. And German arms had also reached the Boers, and they were inflicting casualties on the British. And this is happening at the same time that the British were being pursued by the Germans for that alliance that the British were unlikely to give. And here Germany was supporting, rhetorically and materially, an insurgent group they were fighting. And the interpretation is that Kaiser Wilhelm II was trying to show the British, hey, look, we can be great friends or we can be a pain in the backside. So, why don't you ally with us? Really want to ally with somebody like that? You want to trust somebody who behaves like that? Anyways, and the last kind of questionable thing is that under pressure from the Navy and the steel industry, Wilhelm II is going to allow for the beginning of a German naval buildup. And, if you're sitting there listening to this as I end this lecture, and you're thinking, this professor's got to have his facts wrong. Like, nobody could do that because it's so foolish. Germany, okay, it does have a coast on the North Sea and on the Baltic Sea. That's true. But its primary threats are not seaborne. Its primary threats are all terrestrial. They're all on land. And so to spend a great deal of treasury on building up a navy seems entirely disconnected from a German military perspective. And I'm not a military guy, so I can't tell you more than that. But it just seems to me a strange thing that if your threats are terrestrial, you build up the land forces. And the second part of that makes it strange is, well, who's going to view that as a threat? Well, not Russia. Because if you end up at war with Russia, yeah, there might be some naval action, but it's going to be a land war. The naval war might be at best a sideshow and probably inconsequential. Who's going to view this as the biggest threat are the British, who are the dominant naval power, and a major naval buildup by another great power is likely to be interpreted by the British as, are the Germans going to challenge our supremacy on the high seas? And what many believe is that Kaiser Wilhelm, well, he was under domestic pressure to do this, right? You can understand why the steel industry wants a naval buildup, because there's going to be a huge demand for the goods they sell. But that there might have been some thinking that Wilhelm could have gone to the British and say, hey, look, we'll stop this if you give us diplomatically the alliance I've been looking for. Actually, Hitler does something similar, though the agreement is not that far-reaching in 1935, when he reaches an agreement with the British to limit Germany's naval buildup. No more than 35% of the British fleet. Who knows? I mean, there's this other theory that Kaiser Wilhelm just loved nautical stuff. He had ships around, model ships and stuff, and that's why he did it. Who knows? I mean, especially with this guy, it's like, who really knows what was going through his head? It probably depended. Margaret Macmillan makes up. It frequently depended on who the last person to talk to him was, and that was frequently the view that he took. So, anyways, by 1900 things are looking a bit strange. In 1898, and I guess this will have to be the last point. The British and the French nearly go to war. I don't think it's going to be on any of these maps, and I don't want to dig one out while I have the lecture rolling. But in sub-Saharan Africa, British and French almost go to war over some of the headwaters of the Nile River at a place called Fashoda. It's the Fashoda Crisis of 1898. And what happened is that a British expedition left from one direction, a French one from another, and they both arrived here and both claimed it as theirs, and they were about to go fight for it, and then they said, all right, let's wait and hear what they tell us to do back home, and they agreed, we're not going to fight, we're going to negotiate this, and more or less the French backed down. However, the French and the British were equally kind of startled at this occurrence. They're like, man, we just came close to war over something that is important, but was it worth going to war over? And that is going to kind of sow the seeds, I guess, for a diplomatic agreement that's coming in 1904 between the British and the French, which will set the British on a course for a pro-French alignment in the Great War that is to come. But I said I would stop at 1900, and so I'm going to stop at 1900, but I think that is an event worth mentioning. When I pick up the next lecture, there are actually several events that take place in the first 5 years of the 1900s, the 20th century, and they're important for this discussion. New actors come in, or at least come into our discussion. Global politics gets a bit bigger, a bit more global, and the politics gets more complicated and interesting as the world moves forward toward what we know as the Great War or World War I. All right, I'll leave you here with this. This was a lot. If you have questions, make sure you go to office hours. Make sure you're keeping up with the readings. I know it's a lot early on, and I'm going to try to add some things that aren't in the textbook later. But for now, make sure you're keeping up with the textbook. It's got a lot of information, but it's tough. Ask questions as always if you don't have it. Otherwise, I hope you're all well, and I'll be back with the next one in, 2 days.